Hello, everybody. I am Rebecca Sanders. I am NRCM's new CEO, and it is a pleasure to be spending time with you this afternoon as we celebrate our environmental achievements at the State House this session. I want to thank you so much for joining us, and not just tonight, but joining us throughout this session and in previous sessions, and all the ways that you do through testifying, submitting letters, calling and connecting with your legislators and in meetings. It's such a critical piece of the work that we do. I like to say that we are based in Augusta, but the power of NRCM really resides in our communities and all of you that are on the phone today. So thank you for everything that you have done so far. There's more work to do in the session that's coming up. We are going to shift to a conversation with our advocates, and Pete Didschein will kick us off. But before we do that, I just wanted to do a little bit of housekeeping. First, I wanted to let you all know that we are recording the session. We may post this online following the webinar itself, but we wanted to let you know that this is being recorded. We also hope, Dina, I saw your note in the chat that you're looking forward to listening. I do also hope that you will engage with us with questions and comments, and we would ask that you use the Q&A box that is probably for most of you at the bottom of your Zoom screen to submit questions and comments to our moderator. We will have about 30 or 40 minutes of an overview of the session, and then we'll move to a conversation with all of you. With that, I want to turn this all over to Pete.
Great. Thank you, Rebecca. And let me also add my thanks to all of you who are joining us today, and also to the Maine people in literally every corner of the state that were involved in the legislative process this year. Without your involvement and interest, we could not have accomplished what we accomplished this year, and we accomplished a lot. So let me jump right to the headline. The next slide is that we have good news to share. Again, this was a good legislative year for the environment at the State House. It was a long session, the longest that any of us have been involved with. It was a challenging session, right up to 3 a.m. on July 27th, well beyond adjournment date. But we accomplished a lot. In the news release that we sent out at the end of the legislative session, we identified 26 different positive bills and spending measures that will contribute to protecting Maine's environment, helping build momentum on clean energy and climate action, and helping enhance our communities and make them more resilient for the future. Next slide. So the first order of business for us always, this year and every year, is to prevent Maine from going backwards. And we always face bills that will send us backwards. And it takes a lot of effort. This slide lists 6 of the bills that would have repealed or ended or prevented us from doing positive actions enacted by previous legislatures. Once you click the slide, boom, we killed these. It was a lot of work, but there are fewer of these rollback bills than there used to be. In the early 2010s, we defeated 100 bad bills. So defeating 6 or 10 was much easier. Next slide. So the real secret of how we contribute to protecting Maine's environment is really that NRCM is in the rooms where it happens, borrowing from the song for the musical Hamilton, which I hope that many of you, if not all of you, have seen and listened to. So these are a few snapshots of Sarah Nichols in the top left at the Environment and Natural Resources Committee, Jack Shapiro in the top right at the Energy Committee, Josh Caldwell at Patagonia mobilizing activists with other colleagues, and the bottom right, I'm joined with other community leaders meeting with the Senate President Troy Jackson. Next slide. And Maine people also are in the rooms where it happens. As I mentioned above, bad things happen if we're not there as active voices for the values that people share about the environment. And that really includes you and the people of Maine who are part of the secret sauce of of why Maine's environmental laws are so strong. In these images, these are our activists who came to the State House on our State House Action Day, which we encourage any of you who have not done it in the past to consider doing it next year. We do it every year, and we connect you to your legislators, and you have a big role to play in helping influence how they'll vote. Next slide. So our winning strategy really is strong advocacy staff, great outreach and citizen engagement, and passionate lawmakers. The chambers of the State House are filled with really wonderful people, challenging people, interesting people, but these are our representatives who are committing a big part of their lives to serving the people of Maine, and we work hard to find common ground across the aisle, and we did that well this year. Next slide. And although people think of Maine often in the country as a whole in terms of red and blue areas, that's really not how we go into the legislative session. We recognize, as this statewide vote on a clean water bond in 2014 reveals, that there are green voters everywhere who, if given a chance to vote yes for the environment, will do so. And what we did this year is worked well with lawmakers, with our coalition partners, with you and people across the state to find a way to get to yes on lots of important bills. So let me now just pass along to Jack Shapiro, who's going to discuss one of our biggest wins of the year, passage of an offshore wind power bill. Off to you, Jack.
Great, thanks, Pete, and thanks everyone for joining this afternoon. It's really great to be with you all. I'm going to talk briefly about two of our big legislative priorities this year in the climate and energy program, offshore wind and also solar net energy billing. So on offshore wind, at 2:56 a.m. on Wednesday, the 26th, the legislature took their final votes approving LD 1895. The legislature adjourned at around 5 a.m. a couple hours later. So we got this in right before the end of the session. On Thursday, the 27th, Governor Mills signed our offshore wind bill that we worked really closely with a bunch of great partners, organized labor, and a key fishing industry group. And on that Friday, the 28th, next slide, President Biden was in town, and he gave our work a shout out when he was here, saying, that this makes Maine a leader in the offshore wind industry, especially on floating offshore wind, and that it's a big, big deal. Next slide. And it is a big deal. This was a bill that we prioritized from last fall, following up on many years of work in Maine, contemplating taking advantage of the world-class offshore wind resource in the Gulf of Maine and Maine's offshore wind roadmap, which really laid out a detailed path forward towards taking advantage of this resource in a way that benefits Maine. But the bill specifically will result in 3 gigawatts of offshore wind being built by 2040. And for anyone who doesn't speak gigawatt, that is about enough power to meet 50% of Maine's overall electricity demand by 2040, including growing. That's important for displacing fossil fuel generation, like the natural gas that makes up the majority of New England's electricity generation, but also electrifying home heating through heat pump adoption and transportation through electric vehicles. And that work is underway too. Just a few weeks ago, Maine more than doubled its heat pump goal. And one of our biggest priorities this summer is instituting new clean cars and truck standards. We're going to be participating in a hearing tomorrow to make sure that happens to drive EV adoption in Maine. Next slide. So one of the reasons why we're so proud of this bill is because we didn't want offshore wind development in the Gulf of Maine at any cost. We wanted to make sure that this development was done responsibly in a way that represented the things that Maine people think are important. All of the development of offshore wind that will occur in the Gulf of Maine will happen far offshore in federal waters. And this bill is how we make sure that Maine's voice is heard in that federal leasing process and maintaining high standards for this new industry. So that means things like dedicated funding for the environment and wildlife and for fisheries research and mitigation. It means job standards. We included incentives to avoid key lobstering grounds to make sure that this is having the minimum impact on Maine's iconic fisheries and fishing industry. And it also has important things around equity and community benefits, making sure that the benefits from this industry are distributed all around the state equitably. Next slide. This bill, though, is really just the beginning of a decade-long, at least, commitment from NRCM on offshore wind. The federal leasing process is going to take place next year. The procurement process that we laid out in this bill, by which the state will solicit bids from developers and choose the best deal for Maine, that's going to happen in 2025 and into 2026. We have a lot of coalition building work that still needs to happen. And we also need to build some other key infrastructure to actually construct these platforms and turbines that are going to be out there generating these new sources of clean electricity for Maine, including developing a dedicated offshore wind port, which is going to be a big, and doing that responsibly, which is going to be a big priority for us. So a big accomplishment this year, something that was only possible through really extensive and dedicated coalition work, but a lot of work still to come on this. So stay tuned. Next slide. All right. So if the left hand is wind, the right hand is solar, part of our clean energy transition. And another one of our priorities was really a defensive battle on solar. And the issue there is net energy billing. And it's pretty complicated. So I'll give a little bit of background. The current program was created in 2019. And the bottom line is that the solar legislation that has been put in place in Maine over the past 4 years has been really successful in its core goals. We now have a solar industry in Maine where we didn't a few years ago. Solar's grown sevenfold in just the past 4 or 5 years. And this program in particular allowed shared ownership models and expanded access to more people to be able to participate in solar and in clean energy. People that can't put solar on their roofs. And it's successfully doing that. It's created hundreds of jobs, and it's saving money for Maine people, for businesses, municipalities, and schools through cheaper electricity. But this program did have a fundamental design flaw, and that is that the compensation for some of these projects was pegged to regional electricity rates that are out of Maine's control and are driven by global fossil fuel markets. So this has been a recurring issue in the legislature. How do we reform this program while still taking what is good, the growth of the solar industry and all the clean energy cost savings and jobs that are created? And so that was what we were working on this year. Next slide. So what we were fighting against was a bill that would really have been an unprecedented rollback of our solar policies in Maine. It would have penalized the 25,000 people participating in net energy billing. It would have basically completely slammed the brakes on any new community or customer-owned solar projects. It would have affected rooftop solar. And it was, it was the result of really an unusual alliance between between some different actors in the legislature, and it got a lot of what that resulted in was a really sort of confusing legislative fight that was very technical, and it was confusing in the public debate and for legislators. So what we were working on was to stop this bill, and next slide, and support an alternative bill, LD 1986. This one winds down the current program through a bunch of deadlines, but maintaining some of the contracts that were already underway. The governor's energy office under this bill is going to be developing a successor program and bringing in a bunch of the federal money that was set aside through the Inflation Reduction Act, which was passed or signed by President Biden a year ago today, and to continue to reduce costs for ratepayers. But also really important is that there's so much focus on the cost of this program and almost no consideration of the benefits. So the Public Utilities Commission, our state's energy regulator, is going to be doing a full accounting of both the costs and the benefits, so we can make much better decisions, less based on rhetoric and more based on facts, to ensure that solar energy going forward is benefiting Mainers. This also is an issue that we expect will come back. We do expect more efforts to eliminate this program. And there's a number of things we'll be doing, including participating in some of the proceedings at the commission on the current program and with the governor's office on the successor program as well. So those are just a couple of our key priorities. We also had a number of other ones as well. It's always a busy times in the Energy Committee at the legislature. But I think I'm done there, so I'll pass it on.
Hi, everybody. My name is Nick Bennett. I'm the staff scientist for NRCM, and I'm going to talk to you about our work on a bill that was related to lithium mining. This bill came about because of a deposit of something called spodumene in Western Maine, Newry specifically. We first learned about this deposit probably 6 or 7 years ago, but it's been building as an issue steadily over the past several years. This is just to give you a sense of where that deposit is. You can see there are 2 pins up there. The left pin is Puzzle Mountain, which is part of the beloved Grafton Loop Trail. The right pin is where this lithium deposit is, and where any sort of mine might go to try to extract the spodumene and make lithium products from it. Next slide. This is just another view of the Grafton Notch area. It's just to say that this is a beautiful and beloved spot in Maine. So there's a lot of strong feeling about whether or not there should be an open pit extraction facility in this area, even if it is for the benefit of our climate. Next slide. This is just another view of where the mine site would potentially go, in this case from Rumford Whitecap, which is a very popular hiking area. So this issue has been complicated for us from the beginning. Obviously, we have a strong interest in seeing battery storage for utilities, and we also have a strong interest in seeing electric vehicles more widely adopted. So lithium is something that we need. It's something that we're going to have to obtain more of from under the ground. We also have to build a recycling industry so that we don't have to be mining for lithium forever, and we have a real circular economy when it comes to this resource. And we are far from being able to do that yet. But the demand for lithium is potentially so great that, you know, the reality is we're going to have some more mining of it. Next slide. So just a couple more pieces of basic information about this. There are really two major sources of lithium in the world. One is from spodumene, and that's the kind we have in Maine, the mineral we have in Maine. That's a crystal, and it involves blasting, excavation, much like hard rock mining for base metals like copper and lead. The other source of lithium in the world, major one, is lithium in brine deposits that are underground. And those are typically extracted from the groundwater and pumped into big storage ponds on the surface and essentially allowed to dry out in the sun. There are impacts associated with both of these mining techniques. In general, the brine mining is much less energy and chemical intensive. So I think that there is some reasonable debate to be had around whether spodumene mining is a great idea. But right now in the world, the Australians are the #1 source of lithium for global industry at more than 50%. And their industry is entirely based on spodumene, hard rock mining. The second biggest source is from Chile, which is where they have brine deposits. There are even bigger brine deposits than those in Chile and Bolivia and Argentina. And I would expect that we will see the brine deposits come to dominate world lithium production, potentially even lithium production in the US, where we have some of both. You'll notice that China is not the world's leading supplier of lithium. One of the things that people who want to push lithium mining in the United States as rapidly as possible say is that we're dependent on China for lithium, and that's bad. And it's just not true. China has a big lithium processing industry, but they too, like us, are dependent on Chile and Australia for much of their raw lithium. And Chile and Australia are strong allies of the United States. So we need to be careful when we bring in national security issues willy-nilly into this fight. Next slide. In the end, we passed a bill that a lot of people were quite worried about, I think. But what I tell people is don't pay such close focus to don't put such a close focus on the title, which sounds like it's relaxing Maine's laws. It's not. This bill that passed is just telling DEP to come back with a scheme for sampling, analysis, and monitoring of sites like the one in Newry. The folks in Newry who own that site, who are a very wealthy couple who own about 7,000 acres in Maine, have made a pitch that their deposit is just like a gravel pit or a quarry, and therefore should be allowed to go forward essentially without any regulation or without a detailed sampling and analysis program. We don't agree with that. In Australia, where they mine spodumene a lot, they require significant sampling and analysis before they allow any open pit spodumene mine to go forward. So DEP needs to come up with a way to do that. We have no experience mining spodumene at scale in Maine, and it's going to take us a while to come up with a system to do that. There will be a hearing at the Board of Environmental Protection when DEP comes up with its draft rules. They have to get through that. That's an opportunity for the public to weigh in. And then the legislature gets the final say on whether this new system is an adequate one. And if we do come up with a method of doing this that meets, that passes muster with the Board of Environmental Protection and with the legislature, then what it would say is if a deposit is really like a gravel pit or a quarry, we'll let it go forward under the laws that we have for those types of deposits, which do allow extraction from a pit. Unfortunately, another mixed message that is out there that some of the folks pushing mining of the new redeposit have been saying is that, well, since we're just like a gravel mine, we don't have to worry about any of the processing. And besides, it's all going to get done in other states. If we're going to have lithium that or spodumene mined to use in batteries, there's a lot of chemical processing that would have to happen in state, and that chemical processing is quite dangerous, much like chemical processing of copper, lead, zinc, or gold. And so this law passed in this past session very clearly stated that any chemical ore processing has to come under the same standards that we have for metals like copper, silver, gold, and lead. And that's as it should be. Again, nothing final happened with the passage of LD 1363. There will be a rulemaking process that's going forward in front of the Board of Environmental Protection, likely later this fall, and then everything will come back to the legislature for them to amend, approve, or reject if they don't like it. So all in all, this is a bill about getting better information about a type of deposit or types of deposit that we don't have a ton of experience with in Maine. And we were happy with the way that it came out. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Nick. We're heading over now to tribal sovereignty, which is an ongoing effort led by the Wabanaki Alliance that has taken form in many different bills over the years. This year, the bill was LD 2007, a bill that was ultimately carried over to the next session in 2024. We'll get into why that came to be, but first, let's just dive into a brief background on this bill. We can jump to the next slide, Kristen. So you may know that there are 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States, but the 4 tribes here in Maine, the Penobscot, the Passamaquoddy, the Micmac, and the Houlton Band of Maliseets are the only 4 in the entire nation that are not recognized as sovereign nations. Rather than that, they're treated as municipalities due to a 1980 Maine Indian Land Claims Settlement Act, and therefore they are regulated by the state as municipalities. This also means that they do not automatically qualify for all funding and laws that are passed at the federal level that are intended to benefit tribal nations. And they've been pushing for sovereignty for quite some time. So this effort is intended to change that and to restore sovereignty to the tribes in Maine so that they may oversee their own lands, engage in traditional practices without limitation, and have access to federal funding. The current administration, however, is staunchly opposed to tribal sovereignty and has not indicated that they will change that position, which gets us into our tactics from this last session. And we can jump to the next slide, Kristen. So first, I just want to give a lot of credit to the Wabanaki Alliance. They have developed over the years a really impressive array of over 200 organizational and business allies that are pursuing a strategy to implement tribal sovereignty here in Maine. This last session, that strategy meant, because of the governor's opposition, that we were seeking bipartisan support and a 2/3 vote in the House and Senate, which would override any potential veto from the governor. However, as was mentioned earlier, due to some partisan clashes during this session, the Wabanaki Alliance and the bill drafters did not feel confident in attaining that 2/3 majority. So instead, what they did is printed the bill without a hearing this session in order to have the bill carried over to next session so that we can continue advocating into next year. Fortunately, next year's legislative body will be the same as this year's. It's a short session, but we have more time over the course throughout until next April, basically, to continue building upon all of the conversations and relationships that we established this last year. The Republican majority leader in the House supports tribal sovereignty. We have a lot of other Republicans that also support, and virtually the majority or almost all of the Democrats support tribal sovereignty. So we're really hoping we can see that 2/3 number next year, which does lead me to the next slide. While LD 2007 did not move forward, LD 2004 did move forward and got a vote. LD 2004 served as kind of a proxy or a litmus test for tribal sovereignty, because it sought to give the tribes in Maine access to federal laws and funds beneficial to federal nations, not full sovereignty, but still an element of what the tribes are asking for. The bill did achieve a 2/3 majority in both the Senate and the House when it was first passed, which was a major accomplishment in and of itself. Ultimately, the administration did then lobby legislators against the bill and pulled away a few legislators that initially supported it, and it did not successfully get a 2/3 vote when it came to a veto override. So the veto was sustained and the bill was not passed. But I think it's reflective of really positive momentum throughout the session. We, at the very end of the year, sponsored and attended a celebration hosted by the Wabanaki Alliance in July to celebrate the progress throughout this year, and we look forward to continuing our work alongside the Wabanaki Alliance into next year and beyond. And I think that's that for tribal sovereignty, but I believe I'm keeping the mic into the next, yes, indeed, the Trails Bond. The Trails Bond, similar to tribal sovereignty, we didn't see the full fruits of our labor this year, but we will have next year to continue advocating for this bill. I can't speak highly enough to the organizational effort that went into the bill this year, and I'd want to take a bit of time to talk about all of the strategies and tactics. We successfully recruited over 300 businesses, organizations, and municipalities onto a sign-on letter in support of this bill. And if we go to the next slide, you can see the geography of that support throughout the state. If you've looked at a map of Maine before, you know that no one lives in the upper left-hand corner. So every livable space in Maine, really we see reflected in supporting the Maine Trails Bond, which is incredible. We also succeeded in garnering bipartisan support from dozens of legislators on each side of the aisle. The sponsors of LD 1156, which is the Trails Bond, were Representative Jessica Fay, who's a Democrat, and Senator Russell Black, who's a Republican. And they were both able to convince a lot of members of their caucus that this is an important bill. Ultimately, the bill fell victim to the fact that the Appropriations Committee did not move any bonds forward this year in light of a significant budget surplus. But we do know that this was the only bond that was strongly in consideration for moving forward despite an adverse political environment for bonding. So that's a really positive thing. We can head to the next slide. I do want to backpedal a little bit just to the contents of this bill. In essence, the bill would put $30 million in a bond that Mainers could approve during a referendum vote in the fall. That funding would then be distributed in grants to organizations and groups around the state working to design, construct, and maintain trails across Maine. This would be a really significant boost to a woefully underfunded trail system. We usually, through the Bureau of Parks and Lands, get just under $1 million for trail construction and maintenance, which is really not enough to address just the backlog of maintenance, let alone all the work we can do to build new trails. So this would be a really significant step forward, especially because Maine is the 5th state in the nation in terms of the percent of GDP that comes from outdoor recreation. So we really need to back that up with quality trails and the maintenance of those trails in such a beautiful state. Okay, on to tactics and the next slide. Awesome. So this really was, we can go back actually one slide, Kristen, sorry, that's a great photo. That's from the press conference that we held at the beginning of the session to generate attention around this bill, and it really did generate a lot of attention, as I'll speak to in a moment here. We started out by convening a strategic group of organizational allies that met regularly throughout the legislative session to kind of determine the best tactics to move forward as a coalition. And we got voices from so many different sectors to be able to represent us, from municipal voices to people who actively work on trails, to active transportation advocates, to health advocates. Really an impressive organizing effort. We held this press conference to kind of kick things off with several impactful speakers from around the state. We generated dozens of letters to the editor and opinion editorials that you probably saw in Maine papers throughout the course of the legislative session. And like I said, we recruited the largest sign-on letter I've ever seen in Maine, with over 300 signatures from organizations and businesses across the state. And we really prioritized the Trails Bond during State House Action Day and just in our members reaching out to their legislators, either from home or at the State House. So I really cannot overstate the strength of our advocacy on this year. And I think that we can call this a success just in and of the organizing and the relationships that we've built through the course of this campaign. And we get to carry that campaign on to next year with really meaningful relationships that we've built with allies, activists, and legislators. We know that it was a very strong contender. We are disappointed that we aren't able to see the actual products and provide you all a bond to vote on this fall, but we're hoping that next fall you will be able to vote on a bond to support Maine trails. So we'll continue that advocacy throughout the course of the year. I've found it really fun to advocate for trails. I've gone out on a bunch of them and taken a bunch of photos, and a lot of people are really passionate about making sure Maine's trail network is as strong as possible. We have such a beautiful state and we should take advantage of that fact. So I think that's all that I have to say on those two issues, and I'll pass it on to the next person.
All right, great. Thank you, Josh. I believe that's me. Who's up next? My name is Sarah Nichols. Hello, everybody. I'm delighted to be here to tell you about the work that we did this session to support Maine's redemption centers and modernize Maine's bottle bill. It's always so fun to begin talking about our bills in the past tense once they've become law. I also need to express my gratitude for all of you for your interest in these important issues and for taking the time out of your busy days to join us. We really can't do this work without your support, and I'm always just so grateful for you all. It's really nice to see so many familiar names on the participant list. So in case you missed it, Maine's bottle bill is the state's most successful litter prevention and recycling program, but inflation and labor shortages were threatening the viability of Maine's redemption centers because of the way that they get paid. Last summer, many of them began to close, as you may have noticed, and we knew it was time to raise the handling fee, which is not separate from the deposit. It's the statutorily set 4.5-cent fee paid to redemption centers by beverage companies per container. It's the only way that they make money. And also the time was ripe to modernize the 45-year-old program. So this has been a long time coming. You can go to the next slide, please. So we heard that Representative Allison Hepler, who was also on the webinar today, hi Allison, was interested in working on legislation. So we joined forces with her, and I'm so glad that we did because she's a total powerhouse. I wish we had more lawmakers like her. You know, she really cares and does her homework and is really smart. I'm just, thank you, Allison. And so we spent several months leading up to the bill submission deadline in December, drafting the language and changing it daily, multiple times a day based on our conversations. We asked stakeholders that we knew had disagreements to work together and figure them out. We did tours at redemption centers, clink, distributors facilities, recycling processing facilities. And we asked other bill sponsors with bottle bill related titles to join forces with us so that we could make an easier time for the committee. So we did a lot of work. So next slide, please. So the plan from the beginning really was to pass two separate bills, which we did. So we needed an emergency handling fee increase bill to get the redemption centers the immediate relief that they needed. So unlike regular bills, emergency legislation requires the support of at least 2/3 of lawmakers, and they go into effect immediately upon the governor's approval. So we needed to do this while we redefined how the program is administered in a way that we could, thread the needle between all stakeholder interests and anticipate the needs of the committee and feeling comfortable moving forward with such an overhaul to such an important program. So you can go to the next slide. So this is a picture of Peter Welch. He's a redemption center owner and friend in Portland who really helped to spread the word to redemption centers and get them engaged in this effort. I've learned so much from him. Part of the issue here is that there's no representation for redemption centers. There's no trade group or lobbyist to represent their interests. So, we kind of took on that role in a way because they really are the backbone of this important program, and they are hardworking Mainers who really needed help. So the redemption centers gave very compelling testimony, and the only opposition was from the beverage industry folks who, despite their ability to raise their own prices to meet cost increases, were opposed when redemption centers really could not. They have to go to the legislature to ask for a raise. So the bill ultimately passed with the emergency clause through the House and Senate with ease and became law in early May. In addition to the unanimous support for the bill to increase that 4.5 cents to 5.75 cents, the committee vowed to pass a modernization bill to deal with the other issues, mainly ending in the brand level sorting at redemption centers. So you can go to the next slide. So then all the significant action really happened with its LD 1909, which is Representative Hepler's modernization bill. All that really happened after we passed the emergency handling fee increase. We had a really intense, impassioned public hearing on this and a competing bill. Many intense meetings and conversations with stakeholders. I'm really impressed with the leadership of Senator Stacey Brenner in helping facilitate this process through the committee. And this bill passed on June 1st out of the committee, which is the 45th anniversary of the start of the program, which I think is really special. And, you know, the biggest change that the public will see is that there will still be a bottle bill, a thriving bottle bill program, that without these two laws, I doubt there would be many places to redeem your containers now and into the future. But you might also notice that there's way fewer sorts that are going to be happening at the redemption centers. So they'll only have to sort by material type and not by brand. So you won't see them throwing things into hundreds of different boxes, maybe just a couple dozen different boxes. And there'll also be a stewardship group, a cooperative that's going to form that's responsible for making sure that everything runs smoothly, which we don't currently have now. And there'll be a lot more public education and a website to find out where to take your containers back near you, which I think will be really helpful for people visiting our state that don't live here. Further, any unclaimed deposits that people don't redeem their containers, their deposits have to go somewhere, and those will go to support the bottle bill program and encourage the use of technology in redemption centers and have more investment in reuse and refill infrastructure here in Maine, which I'm really, really excited about. Okay, so next and last slide for me is my takeaways. Please always redeem your beverage containers. That's the best way that you can continue to support this program. The bottle bill saved, and people would have lost their jobs and businesses had we not passed these. But for you going forward, please always redeem your bottles and cans. This is money for you or charity, much needed revenue for the redemption centers. They do get paid by container. So the more containers that you can bring there and not put in the regular recycling bin, the better. And that also saves money for your municipality. Please tell your friends and neighbors about that. And I'm happy to entertain any questions. And I believe I'm passing it back over to Rebecca.
All right. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you, everybody, for this amazing work. It is really extraordinary as I finish my first session here working with this team, what they accomplish every year, and in partnership with the folks in the legislature and with our amazing communities around the state of Maine. I have been really impressed, and I think about how we approach our environmental legislation in a way that is forward-looking and practical and really centered on protecting our environment, but also providing benefit to community. I think especially, Sarah, the work that you do, that you just talked about, a really tangible community and economic benefit for the state. So thank you. We're going to turn to Q&A right now, and I just wanted to remind folks, if you have a question, please use the Q&A box at the likely in the bottom bar of your Zoom screen. It may be at the top as well, and we will hopefully get through many of these. So Jack, the first question is for you on net energy billing, and the question is if we understand or know that the public advocate is satisfied with the revisions to net energy billing, and if not, what other changes should we expect or should we be working to make going forward?
Yeah, yeah, it's a good question. Our understanding is that the public advocate, based on the legislation that he put together and supported, was really willing to make drastic changes to the net energy billing program that would have a lot of consequences for existing solar customers and for any prospect of building medium size or small scale solar going forward. So I don't think, I think as I mentioned towards the end of my remarks, I don't think that we've heard the end of this. I think we'll see additional efforts to do this. I think our principles on this are that is that generally speaking, we want to pay as low a cost for solar as possible. But we also are going to need solar at all scales to help meet our climate goals. We are going to need large scale solar and the incredibly low price points that comes in at. But we also need, that comes with its own challenges in interconnections and siting. There aren't and so we're going to need that sort of smaller scale solar as well. And we want people to be able to participate. Again, it's sort of an equity issue. Not everyone is able to put solar on their roof. They may not have the money to do that. They may not have the roof, the rooftop that's appropriate for that. So, but we still want people to be able to participate if that's something that they want to do. So, I think we're going to be continuing to work on solar policy in the upcoming session and really for years to come.
Thanks, Jack. Josh, we have a question for you. It's a technical question here about the LD number and tribal sovereignty. Should we expect to see that same LD number in the next session, or will it emerge under a different number?
Yes, we should expect to see the same number for next year in 2024, and we hope to see it pass that year. If it doesn't, then there will be a whole new host of legislators after an election in 2024. And so going into 2025, we would see a new iteration, but for next year, we can expect it to be LD 2007.
Great, thank you. Jack, I'm going to pass it back to you. Offshore wind has been the hot topic in Maine for the last few months, and so we have a whole set of questions here. So I'll pose them one at a time, and we'll stick with you for a little bit. Could you talk about this sort of new technology with floating turbines that may lend uncertainty to the cost and viability of offshore electricity generation? So how should we be thinking about that connection between increasing size, increasing distance, and that connection between cost and viability? And are the floating turbines that have emerged as a new technology out of University of Maine, do we think those are viable?
Yeah, so I didn't get into this in depth, no pun intended, but the offshore wind in the Gulf of Maine is going to be floating turbines on sort of these big floating platforms that are anchored to the seafloor, unlike a lot of the projects that are under construction in southern New England and elsewhere that are fixed on foundations built directly into the seafloor. So floating offshore wind is a new technology, relatively new technology. The turbines and the nacelles and the blades is all pretty well understood, but the floating aspect of it is still relatively new. What that represents in terms of an opportunity for Maine and our leadership in floating offshore wind is that there aren't that many places where the water is shallow enough to build fixed bottom offshore wind. So it's estimated that between 2/3 to 3/4 of the offshore wind that we will ultimately need around the world to transition away from fossil fuels and to being powered by clean energy is going to need to be floating. So that's why so many experts and analysts are so excited about Maine's opportunity to develop this technology here. Because it's new, the specific hull design that is going to become the least expensive and most mass producible is not really known yet. We're excited about the University of Maine's technology. One of the things that makes that unique is that it is largely made of concrete, which is something that we can produce in Maine, whereas many of the other designs are largely made of steel, which is something that we don't produce in Maine. So that was sort of the thinking behind the University of Maine's design for their hull. But we don't really know which as the floating industry, which has a lot of projects in the pipeline, but not that many actually constructed yet. We don't really know which one is going to sort of get that that lead in terms of where, in terms of what will become viable to mass produce. For the size question, I don't think there's a lot of uncertainty in the size. I mean, there's sort of two competing dynamics that are happening in the industry right now. According to the industry folks, there's really no engineering limit to the size that these turbines could get. So far, the biggest ones in operation are about 15 megawatt turbines, which have about a 500-foot tower. They're significantly bigger than onshore turbines, which are oftentimes limited by, the segments of the towers that can go under certain bridges and what can be on trucks that can turn on certain roads. So there's a limit onshore, but offshore there is not. The power that a single turbine generates is a function of the area which the rotors sweep. So the bigger that you get an exponentially amount larger of energy coming out of that turbine. However, there's also advantages to mass producing turbines of a certain size and not necessarily pushing the limit for how much bigger that they can go. So that's a debate that's happening in the industry right now. Is it better to have fewer sort of giant mega turbines, especially as you have floating platforms that can be so far offshore that they'll never be seen? Or do you just try and get the cost down more quickly by settling on a given size that's standard for the industry and just saying, go, 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 we're going to make these at as low a cost as possible? So I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Jack. That was great. And a follow-up question to that is that you're talking about these really large structures in deep waters. How do we think about storms and hurricanes and how these survive the impacts of those?
The engineers are really confident with this. With the University of Maine's design in particular, they did deploy a 1/8 scale turbine off of Castine about 10 years ago. And that turbine went through a really sizable nor'easter, which gave them a really good real life test of how really challenging ocean conditions would, how it would fare in those conditions. And it came through with flying colors. I think the scale of these is sometimes a little bit hard to picture, but for the University of Maine's platform, it's a concrete triangle. It's about a length of a football field along each side. And it's about 100 feet tall with 2/3 of that underneath the water. So it's semi-submersible. And what that means is that even a 40 or 50-foot wave is just going to wash over the top by 10 or 12 feet. But relative to the entire size of the platform, they're pretty confident that these are going to stand up to any of the conditions that are going to be seen, even in the Gulf of Maine, which has which has notoriously severe storms.
One last question for you to close out the offshore wind section, which is about our understanding of the impact of offshore wind on wildlife, in particular whales and their migration route. And I know you have been working with Maine Audubon on understanding this. Could you share some perspective on what we think those impacts might be and how we're learning about them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think a key thing here is going to be the operation of Maine's research array. I didn't speak of that that much because the bill we were working on is sort of a successor to that research array. But this project is a 12 turbine array. It's sponsored by the state using University of Maine's technology, and will have a specific research agenda formed around it that will include impacts on wildlife and the ecosystem from the operation of some of these full-size multi-turbine arrays that are contemplated for the Gulf of Maine. I think one thing that's really important, though, to remember is that one of the biggest drivers of change in the Gulf of Maine ecosystem right now and in the ocean is the change in climate. A lot of the reasons why, for example, the North Atlantic right whale has been moving into different parts of the ocean is because of the changing distribution of their key prey species. And so that's just one example of the many changes that that we're already seeing in the ocean due to climate change. And so we have to take into account the potential impacts from offshore wind with the potential and sometimes known impacts from our changing climate, which are already pretty significant too. But I will say we're absolutely committed to making sure that that research agenda is robust, making sure that it's funded, and making sure that both the plans that developers submit to Maine as part of which projects get selected as part of our procurement that we put in place, but also all of the federal permitting processes, which is how we will know how these projects will operate and be constructed, are also taking those things into account as well. It's really important to us.
Thank you. That was really informative. I have a question for you, Pete, about a bill that we didn't take a position on. We're really intentional about how we go about our work, and we've rarely engaged in environmental education bills from the perspective of the person that asked this question. Why in particular did we not take a position on LD 1817, the Maine Outdoor School for All?
Sure. We actually did submit testimony. Melanie Sturm, who's not with us today because she's on vacation, submitted testimony on that bill. It's an exciting bill. It's a bill that was going to provide $6.2 million a year for immersion outdoor education for Maine grade school kids, 4th grade through 8th grade. And it was introduced by Senator Stacey Brenner. I spoke to many legislators about it. It did receive an incredible number of original co-sponsors. She kept the jacket open is the language, and she got maybe 50 or 70 co-sponsors of the bill, bipartisan across the aisle. Environmental education is really important and strongly supported by Maine people because we recognize this place that we want to protect. We want to ensure that each successive generation spends time in it so that they learn to love the place and contribute to its long-term protection. But at the core of this question is the challenge we face in setting priorities. There was about 2,000 bills introduced this year. We read every single one of them and kept track of 160 of them in our internal spreadsheet. We testified on 60 of them. And one of the big lessons we learned is passing big bills like the offshore wind bill, like the bottle bill, like the trails bond bill, takes an enormous amount of effort. And we are a finite resource, so we do have to make decisions about how we allocate our advocacy time, our advocate time, our outreach time, our organizing time, our media and communications time. In the end, this bill, with its pretty big price tag, $6 million a year, 12 million over 2 years. The amount of money that was available on the so-called appropriations table at the end of the legislative process was only 12 million. And there was $1 billion worth of bills competing for that 12 million. So this one bill would have, eaten up all the money available in a very tough competition year. But I commend you for prodding us on this. We do appreciate being pushed by our members to continue to pay attention to these bills. And I was paying attention to this, but because so many other groups and lawmakers were involved, it didn't seem like our incremental engagement was going to move the needle to ensure that it would pass.
Thank you, Pete. And we have one last question, and it's for you, Sarah. You didn't talk about LD 1814, and I'm hoping that you could share a little bit of information about that. What does that actually require us to do? And thinking about, do we have to go and start switching out our light bulbs? What is the actual implication of that bill?
Sure. So that bill effectively bans the sale of CFL light bulbs. So those are mercury containing light bulbs, typically tubes that you see in the ceiling of office buildings or maybe your basement, or the twisty light bulbs. Those contain mercury in them. And so when they're not disposed of properly, mercury can escape into our air and water, which we don't want to happen. So we've joined, I believe it's 6 other states at this point who are going to be banning the sale of those. Ours is by 2027. We had to bump it out a year. You will not be penalized if you have these in your home. They're fine to have. Don't let them break, and take them back to your transfer station, or go online. I can put the link in the chat to see a retail location that you can take those safely back to. But when you do need to replace it, you can replace it with an LED bulb, which is much more cost efficient, much more energy efficient, and does not have toxic mercury inside. So you'll find that a lot of stores still aren't selling those anyway. So because they've come around, because consumers already like LEDs better.
Thank you. And with that question, we're closing out our webinar for the 2023 legislative session. I want to thank everybody here for participating, our amazing advocates, all of you on the call. Thank you for all that you do to make Maine an amazing place to live, to work, and explore. We couldn't do this without you, and we're so pleased to have your support, your questions, and your engagement. Thank you.